It's hard to escape the conclusion that something out of the ordinary has happened to our weather. Across the globe, a pattern is emerging. From Japan to Greece to the Arctic Circle to here in the UK. The question, of course, is what is happening?
I would be pretty certain that you couldn't have had this hot air, this heat event that we've got at the moment without climate change.
Professor Joanna Haigh is a climate scientist at Imperial College London.
It's not proof, you can't really put it like that. What you can say is that these events are becoming increasingly common, and where they used to be uncommon, and now they're more usual, that is probably associated with climate change.
You say probably. How certain in your mind are you?
Well, the sorts of temperatures that are occurring now would have been a 1 in 1,000 occurrence in the 1950s, and now they're about a 1 in 10 occurrence. And that's because the average temperature is moving up, so the extremes are getting less extreme.
So how extreme? Well, if we take the average temperature for January to June from 1910 to the year 2000, and we use that as our benchmark, and then we plot every year from 1880 to 2018 to show how far above or below that average line they fall, well, the pattern is very clear. The world is getting warmer and warmer. 2018 was actually 0.77 of a degree centigrade above the average, which is the fourth hottest year on record for the period, behind 2015, 2017 and 2016, all very recent history. As for that famous 1976 heatwave, although the summer was hot, the average for January to June was actually slightly colder than the long-term trend. According to scientists then, we can expect to see more long hot summers like this one, but that means we're going to have to make some changes. The Environmental Audit Committee of the House of Commons will be publishing a report on Thursday looking at how we'll need to adapt to more frequent heat waves.
There's not really a problem with it today or tomorrow. And the issue is also that heat-related deaths tend to turn up in retrospect. So nobody turns up at the hospital and says, I'm dying of heat. But actually, there tends to be a time lag before we realise what has happened. So there isn't the pressure on policymakers that I think there needs to be. And this is a cross-government issue, so DEFRA has responsibility for adapting to climate change, but many of the other departments, such as Homes and Local Government, the Department for Transport, are the ones where actually the rubber literally hits the melting road.
One of the big problems is that we have building regulations designed for a colder Britain. New build properties are constructed to keep the heat in during freezing winters, not let it out during boiling summers.
So what we want to see is better adaptation of our buildings for these hotter temperatures, particularly our homes, schools, hospitals and care homes as well. And at the moment that's not happening. So we don't see any standard or requirement at present in government to adapt these new builds when they're being designed. And we'd also like to see an increase in the amount of urban green space in urban areas to protect people more from high temperatures, but that's actually going down rather than going up.
Meanwhile, the heat is brewing up thunder, with the Met Office issuing storm warnings for Friday for the north and east of England. However, it's not clear that we've seen the last of the hot weather for this year, let alone for the summers to come.
Well, that was David Grossman there, and I'm joined now by the Met Office's Chief Scientist, Stephen Belcher, and by Dr Chris Hope from the University of Cambridge. He's worked as a climate change advisor to the UK Government and to the Obama administration, was a lead author for the third and fourth assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Very nice to have you both here. And Stephen Belcher, if I can start with you, I use the phrase the new normal. Do you think this is now something that we have to get used to?
Well, the heat wave that we're seeing at the moment, the jet stream it's kind of got stuck, which is rather unusual. And that's given us a period of high pressure over the UK, which has led to this very warm weather. And as your piece said, the Met Office are forecasting mid-30 degrees towards the end of this week. And it's a reminder of what the climate can throw at us. So is it the new normal? Well, let's think back to 1976. There are actually some characteristics of this event that look rather like 1976. One of the things that we think is driving that stuck jet stream the sea surface temperature patterns in the Atlantic, in the North Atlantic, and they look strikingly similar to what we saw in 1976. However, what we didn't see in 1976 was this band of heat waves right around the Northern Hemisphere. So 1976 was very localised around the UK. Now we're seeing heat waves in Scandinavia, in Japan, as your earlier piece described. So since 1976, the global mean temperature has risen by more than half a degree. So any extremes that we get are superimposed upon that warming. So it makes it more likely that these extreme events are going to give us higher temperatures.
And you would suggest by that that this will happen more often then? I mean, if it doesn't happen next year, of course, there'll be a chorus of people saying, oh, you see, it was all rubbish and nothing happened at all. If it doesn't happen next year or the year after, do we revert to mean, as it were?
So the heat wave that we've got is probably part of natural cycles in the weather, subject to analysis, and we've got a big programme of work at the Met Office studying this, but it's superimposed on this background of global warming, and that's what's elevating our temperatures. So if we think back, another heat wave that's very important for Europe was the 2003 heat wave. And work led by the Met Office, we were able to show that greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere doubled the chance of the temperatures we saw in 2003 compared to what we'd expect in a pre-industrial world. And furthermore, by the 2040s, the temperatures we saw in 2003 would be an average summer. So a couple of years ago, we had another look at that to see how we were tracking towards that projection that 2003 would look a normal summer for Europe by the 2040s. And actually, we're right on track. If you look at temperatures across Europe, they're tracking that projection that by 2040s, 2003 temperatures...
We're crossing that dot.
We're looking like they will be normal.
So for you, Chris Hope, if you're looking at the economics of this change now, where do you start telling the government they should be putting their money? I mean, how do you make the preparations?
Well, as Stephen has said, and as your report showed, the temperature rise that we've seen up to date has been about 1 degree compared to pre-industrial times. And if we carry on as we have been doing in terms of emitting the greenhouse gases, then it's likely that by the end of this century, the temperature will have risen by probably 4 degrees. It may be 3, it may be 6, but round about 4 degrees. And so we would expect to see far more of these kind of events occurring. We would expect to see sea level rise, and we would expect to see some rather more frightening things certainly possibly occurring, like a more rapid melting of ice in the Arctic, release of...
Can we cope with that in this country?
Well, in this country, we can cope with it by some adaptation. We can grow different crops. We can make sure that we're protected against some of the sea level rise of 0.5 metre to 1 metre. But the risks are, if it carries on going in this sort of way and we don't do anything about it, then it will get beyond our ability to adapt to it. And therefore we have to try and take action to bring down our emissions of greenhouse gases.
Of course, you don't want to work towards it, I can see that. But at the moment, if you are talking to those in agriculture or those planning our cities or housing, what are you having to adapt, or what are you telling them to change to prepare?
What I'm telling people in government, and what the government is taking notice of both in America in the previous Obama administration and also analysis that was done for the Treasury in this country, is that what we need to have is a level playing field. We need to make sure that we charge people who are emitting greenhouse gases for the damage that they are causing. We need to have a very strong...
on an individual consumer basis or on an industry basis?
It needs to be a strong climate change tax, probably starting around about $100 per tonne of carbon dioxide. It needs to be comprehensive, because if we're going to avoid this rise in temperature to 4 degrees, we need to take really serious action, and therefore it needs to be on all sectors, agriculture, industry, but also domestic energy use. It needs to rise over time, because as we get closer to the date when these serious effects are likely to occur, the damage from putting 1 more tonne of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere gets higher and higher.
Could you see this being sold to a government politically?
Well, what we saw in 2015 in the Paris Conference of the Parties was 197 countries come together and propose plans for how they would reduce
That's
greenhouse gas
a long way off, though, isn't it, to an
emissions.
actual taxation on the individual,
but it's
starting from now.
197 countries coming to agreement. And I think one of the landmark scientific contributions ahead of that was to understand how, as we add each tonne of carbon to the atmosphere, how much global warming we might expect. So that gives us a budget as an international community for how much carbon we can emit to stay below those ambitious targets.
But briefly, is there any
Paris.
upside to what is happening now? I mean, can you look and see the savings, for example, on fuel? Do you worry less about, security of fuel? Would you be looking at an upside to this?
Any upside that we've seen would probably been in the past, with temperatures rising maybe a half a degree or something like that. We're certainly getting into the state where we're not seeing an upside, we're seeing a downside. And the way to sell this argument, and it's been accepted by more than 50 governments and organisations across the world, is to say, when you put this climate change tax on fossil fuels, you reduce the taxes on other things, on income, on sales, on national insurance. You reduce
So you make
the
it your
taxes,
priority.
you
but
reduce the
don't.
taxes on things you want to encourage, like employing people, and you put the taxes on things you want to discourage, like emissions of greenhouse gases, and we can make the economy work better by doing that.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much. Thanks for coming in.